All right, welcome back, everybody. You're all extremely welcome to the second in our fantastic series, Prophy Predicts. This time we're going to be talking about academic assessment. My name's Gareth. I work on partnerships with Prophy. And today, for our event, I'm delighted to be joined by four fantastic panelists. Judy Mielke from Scientify Research, Paul Tuinenburg from Impactor and Global Campus, Jonny Coates from Rippling Ideas, and shortly, our dear friend Avi Staiman from Academic Language Experts. What we did in this event, as we've done in our previous event, is ask our fantastic panelists to join us for a discussion. But to get things going, we asked them a question and we want to make predictions about what's going to happen, not in the immediate future, but over a period of time in academic publishing and academic research, 2 to 5 years. So last time, we talked about research integrity, threats that would be facing the scholarly publishing community in the next 2 to 5 years. And today, in this episode of Prophy Predicts, we're going to talk about academic assessment. So with that being said, I'll hand immediately over to Judy, and we'll talk a little bit about her answer to this question. We asked all of our panelists to give us some predictions. What do they think will be happening over the next 2 to 5 years in academic assessment for researchers, for publishers, and for the wider scholarly industry? Judy, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Prophy team, for having us. It's such a pleasure to work with you guys. And for everybody here, so glad you could join us. So I'm going to share with you my 5 cents or 2 cents worth of opinion. So I think as with everything in research, it's very important that you know what my background is, so what my perspectives are, and therefore also be able to interpret maybe any biases that I may have. So, first of all, I'm Judy Mielke. I am the founder of Scientify Research, and our mission is to support and empower researchers because we believe the work that you guys are doing is so important for society. We need you for generating knowledge. We need you to also address the societal challenges that we have. So you guys have a lot of responsibilities. It's our job to make it easier for you. So we have a research funding database. And prior to launching the business, I was also a researcher, and I also worked in science publishing for quite a while. And the reason why we started a funding database is because, well, everything starts with funding, right? So funding is so important to everything in research. And that also comes back to the question today, what is the future of academic assessment? And so why do we even need academic assessment? Well, first principles, right? So I would say we need academic assessment because, quite frankly, there's not enough money to go around. There is so much pressure on you, the academics, the researchers, that for the limited pool of resources that we have. And so for funders, they need to decide where to make that investment. So, and that investment, they need to see that return on investment. And when it comes to the assessment, so the future of academic assessment, um, I'm not sure if this is a prediction, because if it were a prediction, I'm not sure that in 2 to 5 years there will be much change. But it's more about what I think we should do. So some ideas. So throwing our ideas to the room and really talking about how we should change together, right? So when it comes to funders, so funders are the ones usually dictating research assessment, academic assessment. So what are funders looking for? And from a funding database perspective, we see that there is a shift over this period already. There is more and more recognition about real world impact of research. And so, what is real world impact of research, right? Is it still going to be, I'm going to say something maybe a little bit provocative to the publishers. So, is it still a Nature paper? Or is that great, but you need even more, right? And also, I think what we need to think about is what is the world like today, right? So a Nature paper typically is going to take you a few years of research, and then even probably even more time for peer review and publication. So there's a lot of delay. So I would argue that research assessment is too slow. So it's not showing research in real time. And I think assessment needs to be more real time, more transparent. It needs to be more efficient. So yeah, I would say assessment, at least in the sense of peer review, it's not really a very efficient system. It's probably the best that we have right now, but I think we can do better. Um, and when it comes to speaking of peer review, I think there's a lot of biases that coming. As we all know, right? I mean, we have all experienced this. There may be research reviewers who try to suppress other people's ideas, and we want to possibly avoid that, right? To have a more fair system. So I would argue a faster system, a more transparent research, so more transparency at all stages. It's not only waiting for the output, but really at all stages of the research process that this communication with the world is happening. And also then about recognition. So your recognition is not just your end result publication, or even better, like, commercial product from research, but really every single step of the way. And also how you participate within the process, right? So are you contributing? Or are you just, there are always this 80-20 rule. I think there's a lot of reviewers that review all the time, and there's a bunch of people also who never review. So how can we make this a more fair process that maybe like if you have 5 papers published, you need to at least review 10 papers, something like this, right? So yeah, so these are some of my ideas. But yeah, I think over to the rest of the panel
Fantastic.
to share
Fantastic.
their
It's
ideas.
really great, like as an introduction, Judy. Thank you so much. Like funding agencies, like making the process faster, making the process fairer, like dealing with peer reviewers. And yeah, like I mean, I look at my research output, like, and I really don't feel that like the papers I published in the leading journals are some of my best work. We're going to go like to our good friend Avi Staiman from Academic Language Experts. Avi, how are you doing today? Great you could join
I'm
us.
doing well. I'm doing well. Always good to see you, Garrett, and see familiar faces here, and I'm glad to be here. It's a pleasure to join you.
Do you want
All
to give us
right.
your answer to our question? Will you make a prediction, Avi? What will happen to academic assessment in the next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah, so I'm glad we started with Judy because I think Judy started with where we should be going, and I'm going to make a kind of cold, more kind of prediction about where I think we are going. So just to not confuse that this is necessarily my ideology, it's just trying to kind of be more of an analyst and less of an idealist. But I'm actually really happy that we have both perspectives because I think that we need to know where we are and we need to know where we want to go, and then we can figure out the path there. Okay, so here's my kind of sobering, I guess, approach to where we are, and I think it has a lot to do with AI. What I'm hearing from journal editors, and I'm starting to see in some early research, but it's still kind of really a lot of preprints and kind of early stage research, is that the editorial offices are simply overwhelmed. There's a deluge, there's a flood of incomings. Into their already strained staffs, and it may well be the straw. Well, it's not the straw. It may well be the 10-pound cannonball that breaks the camel's back, because it's interesting. So what they tell me is they've got you've got your articles that come in, and the known authors and the people who are doing really serious research, and that's kind of good to go. Then you've got the stuff which is so clearly AI that it can just be tossed, from the slush pile straight into the junk pile pretty quickly, and you don't really need to worry about it. But there's this kind of middling section where they start to, read the paper, and it looks interesting, it looks engaging, and all of a sudden there's some odd bits to it, and they start asking themselves, well, what is this the result of? And this is actually a really challenging question because it could very well be that you're reading, let's say, a research from a non-native English-speaking researcher, and they may just not have chosen the right phrase, or I'm not even going to say right or wrong, just the kind of colloquial or accepted local phrase, and that kind of raises some bells. Now, in that case, we would definitely not want to cancel their submission because of, a phrase that's a bit off. I'm a big proponent of looking at the science, not everything around it. On the other hand, if we see certain telltale signs, we may start asking ourselves questions. Well, maybe this is AI. Now, in theory, there's a solution to this problem, or at least the solution that's been put forth by most journals is to say you can use AI in different parts of your work part. I mean, I know we've got Paul is here with us, who's going to speak shortly. He's got an awesome AI tool that helps researchers find co-partners. I'm the biggest AI proponent there is. The issue becomes when it comes to transparency and disclosure of those AI tools. So what most publishers have said, and most editorial offices have said, is go for it. Use AI. Just tell us how you've done it, which sounds simple, but lurking behind that simplicity is actually a lot of confusion and complication. But what I want to focus on for today is we've got a problem because what happens is that actually people are not disclosing their AI. So a recent Science article showed that 3 out of 100 people disclose their AI, yet 50% of researchers say they use AI at some point in their research workflow. So we've got this big gap here where it's like, okay, well, a lot of people are using it without, disclosing it. So, okay, so you may ask yourself, what does all this have to do with assessment? So here's my kind of, I'm a skeptic of futurism, but here's kind of my prediction or my assessment of what I think is going to happen. What I think is going to happen is you're going to have different kinds of journals. You're going to have the journals that are kind of have the internal editorial teams that can really handle that increased workflow, be able to sift through, understand, do this, the hard, the kind of nitty gritty statistics work to be able to, decipher between the really high quality research and that's not. And then you're going to have the journals that are going to feel the strain of the fact that they're investing more and more of their time into trying to sift, again, in the slush pile and figure out what is legit, what's not legit. Are there kind of the red flags here? To what extent should we be worried about red flags that we see coming up? And what I think is going to happen is it's actually going to push people who are serious about their research to double down on the kind of Q1 journals, or double down on those journals or those publishers who have built that brand and reputation because they are going to have because there's going to be so much confusion around research integrity and so many questions about legitimacy and not legitimacy. I remember my colleague James Butcher saying some of these brands have been built over the course of hundreds of years, right? We're not talking about, recent history. We're talking about old, right? When De Gruyter and Brill merged this year, it was two companies from, what was it, the 1600s, right, that had merged. There's something about the power of that kind of gravitas of what we know, what we're familiar with, which I think is going to become even stronger in a world which is filled with doubt, with AI that's, we're not sure exactly how to handle or what to do with. So again, I'm not saying this is necessarily my prescription for the future, but it is my prediction for how I think things are going to shape up.
Loads to talk about there. That's really fantastic, Avi. Thanks very much. Like AI predictions, the flood of papers, and preprints, which is quite fortuitous because with us today, we have Jonny Coates, Rippling Ideas, one of the leading proponents of preprints around at the moment. Dr. Jonny, how are you doing today? Will you join us to make a few predictions about what you think is going to happen over the next 2 to 5 years in academic assessment as a former current academic as well, of course?
Yeah, am I still a current academic? I haven't published for a while. I am going to make a prediction. I think I'm going to sit somewhere in between the two views we've heard so far. I really, really pains me to say this, but I think I kind of agree with Avi on how the journals are responding to all of these kind of things going on. One of the things I know is happening within journals is they're really doubling down on things like peer review as this way of getting around a lot of the problems that we're now seeing, especially with AI. Personally, I think that's the wrong approach. So I have been a little bit more hopeful in my prediction. In talking about my prediction, I'm going to be a lot more realistic and say this is actually probably unlikely to happen within the next 10 years. Change is slow. We're going to need longer than that. But what I think we are going to see eventually is actually academic assessment going way beyond journal brand, peer review, and also just research. Right now, anyone who is an academic with a big teaching portfolio will complain to you that their career pathway is really hard because everything is judged on research output. And I think that in fellow roles, so there is an effort now for teaching to really go towards that. But I think we are going to see more of an effort towards recognizing service activities. So peer review is a service that is currently unrecognized. I think the best way of recognizing that is actually through hiring promotion type situations. The impact of the work beyond where you've published, so actual real world impact, are you being cited in policy documents? Is your work actually being used beyond being cited by like 10 people? Which actually, for what it's worth, if your paper is cited by more than 10 people, you're doing pretty good as far as the literature goes, which is also quite a sad statement. But basically, my prediction is we are going to see a much greater focus on a wider variety of metrics when we assess not just researchers, but research itself. So I do think we are going to see more preprints. Right now, that's in a weird place. Preprinting has largely stalled in the life sciences, which is not, again, not a thing I'm happy to say, but it is the reality. And I think part of the way we're going to combat things like the rise of AI is actually through a much greater variety of trust signals. This is a thing I've been talking about for years now, and it feels like finally other people are beginning to talk about it. So when I say trust signals, what I mean by this is peer review is a trust signal, right? It's a signal that at least 2 or 3 people have read the work and have commented on it. Now, by all means, right now that as a trust signal is kind of decreasing because people are more likely just to put it through AI and let AI tell you what it thinks of the work. But it is a marker of trust in a bit of work. Where an article gets published can be a marker of trust. It's not a very good marker because we saw Nature recently with the AlphaFold stuff completely obliterate their own peer review policies in order to push, fancy, sexy work through. But I do think these are still important things that are going to happen. Avi's statement about journal brands being very, very old and how entrenched that is in how we think about them, that is not an easy thing to move beyond. That's going to stay for probably a very long time. But we do need to look at those a bit more objectively because, like I said, Nature is a good example, been around for a very long time, not necessarily the strongest for peer review. But we need to move beyond those. So we need to look at what open science practices are occurring. Are people sharing their data? Is the code reproducible and usable and out there? And all these other things that feed into a much wider variety of being able to determine an individual output and an individual's career output as being trustworthy or not. And trust for me is probably the thing that's going to become really, really important moving forward. That's kind of the key word for me moving forward. We're seeing this across the board, and I think that's going to feed into assessment as well.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Trust is really, really important. I also really like your point about teaching as potentially being a component of academic assessment. In my experience, I don't know about others on the panel, but I did lots of teaching, but it was never like something that I was assessed for really at my universities. Same with peer review. Okay, brilliant. And certainly not least, let's go down to our friend Paul Tuinenburg from Impactor and Global Campus. Paul, give us some of your predictions for academic assessment and how it will change over the next 2 to 5 years from your perspective. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Gareth. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Paul, one of the founders of Global Campus, indeed. It's a platform that we started a bit over 3 years ago, basically to find academic expertise. We're basing this on publications. You probably have guessed it, as that is basically the only sort of index data that we can use to sort of predict what someone's expertise is. And this is used by publishers to find reviewers, but also by universities, like Avi mentioned, to find collaboration partners, for instance. But why we started Global Campus was basically because 10 years before, we already worked with universities, mostly about the topic of societal impact. So we had workshops where we would basically tell people, and also for me, apologies to the publishers here, like forget about publishing, right? There's only like, I think on average, 3 people reading the publication, which probably is less by now with the ever increase of publications. So focus on real world impact, like at least in the Netherlands where I am based, the focus of policymakers was I think this started 13, 14 years ago, basically when we started our business, to do more with society. So collaborate with a museum, collaborate with a school, collaborate with a company, write a popular book instead of an academic book, right? Just that also non-academics can learn from your work and maybe use it in their daily practice. And that also sort of influenced my prediction. I think I may be between Jonny and Avi. I don't have very high hopes for any change in the near future, basically because I've been to so many conferences since 2012. And since then, the conversations are always the same. Everyone aims for, let's say, what Judy describes. Everyone wants this, but no one acts on it. And if I want to put it a bit more nuanced, only a few people act on it. But since there's been so much focus on publishers, let me take a slightly different view and focus on the non-publishers, because this is not just an issue of the publishers, right? Also in universities, basically the only thing that counts is publishing. And there are so many good teachers, there are so many people that do some entrepreneurial stuff on the side based on their academic work. By the end of the day, if you want to become a professor or want to make a career in academia, no one really cares about all the other stuff. I'm based in the Netherlands, as I mentioned, and when I'm at international conferences, I always hear like, "Oh, the Netherlands it's so great in terms of like this broader impact. They have all these reward and recognition policies in universities, and that may be all true, but it's mostly nice talking and not so much doing the actual work, right? We talk a lot about how we should measure the other stuff, and in some cases it is measured, but as mentioned, by the end of the day, it is typically about how much you publish and where you publish. So 2 to 5 years, in my prediction, not much have changed. Maybe a few more symposia and conversations about how it should be changed. But I do think we're moving that direction. It just moves very, very, very slow. So I do see more initiatives popping up to make it, for instance, easier to start your company based on your academic work. But it's not nearly as where we should be, I guess. And again, to wrap this up, it's definitely not just about these top tier journals. It's really also about the mindset of academics themselves, right? So we know that even if the funder has a policy to not look at H-index, the first thing a lot of reviewers do is go to Google Scholar and see if they can figure out the H-index of the person submitting a proposal to that funder. So it's so embedded in the way of thinking that this will require a big system change, and these are never easy to do. So I'm not very hopeful for the near future in like 2 to 5 years, but I do think we're moving into a direction where we can include much more than just counting publications and impact factors.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. And it would be nice to accelerate the pace of change. Avi, what do you think? Like, do you want to come back? Do you have a few thoughts on what's been said so far in our discussion? Give us your feedback and some suggestions for how we could accelerate the pace of change.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I do a lot of AI trainings and like to think of myself as looking forward, but actually the way I think we need to be, I think we need to be doubling down. Well, I think that, I like the ideas of, a more robust evaluation, and I agree with them. I think we need to be actually doubling down on kind of what makes science, the things that we've taken for granted until now that are, I don't want to say under attack because maybe that's a bit dramatic, but that are, the foundations are more shaky than they were a decade ago. So, for example, science being reproducible, right? Science being traceable. Having to kind of prove your data and to and to share your data openly. All of these things, I think, create a world where even if we're using the AI to help us kind of with improving our papers, we have to start asking ourselves what's the a critical part of research, what's the heart, the beating heart of research, which in most cases is the data, or if it's qualitative study, it might be the interviews, and what is kind of the scaffolding, right? Which is important, right? The words, the paragraphs, right? Which I don't kind of downplay that, but I think needs to be assessed. If that can be automated, do we have an issue with that? My son here is joining me. He wants to say hello. Hope everybody doesn't mind. Um, and I guess he really loves academic assessment. That must be that he was just attracted by the topic. So when it comes down to it, I think that we really need to, especially with the early career researchers, we need to kind of double down on what makes basic research viable and compelling, because it's not just an internal conversation. There's a lot of attacks on science from the outside as well, and a lot of kind of throwing mud at the wall and seeing what sticks in terms of science and even journals. It's funny because I never thought of journals as a political issue, and all of a sudden, right, you see journals popping up in political discussions. So we kind of need to reinvest in the basics, and I think that's what can get us through.
Yeah, I agree. I want to go to Jonny, and can you give us some thoughts on this and how like preprints could help, please, with this issue of trust markers, like accelerating the process, like, and how you feel that, I know you said that preprints are like not being used as much as you would like, especially in the life sciences, but I mean, maybe that's one solution, to look at the preprint output of researchers much more closely.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about preprints are they're free from this journal system, right? So they don't have hundreds of years of we're doing it this way and we're going to keep doing it this way. They can change in the experiment. So we're seeing this with bioRxiv, medRxiv in particular. They're really about to embark on a lot more experimentation around what we can do in terms of assigning trust to a preprint. So they're talking a lot about this sort of constellation model where you have your preprint or other output. It could be a data set. You don't have to have a full narrative. And then there's stuff built around that attached to it. And it all links together with these sort of said constellation kind of thinking instead of a linear way of doing it. That speeds things up. It allows us to assess different things. It opens up how we think about science. I think one of the things that both Paul and Avi mentioned there, Paul was talking about how what we need to change. And one of the things we see quite often with a lot of these efforts are mandates. Mandates don't change things. Mandates, as we've seen, they're quite political. They will change with the whim of whoever's currently running that thing, whether it's the funding body or an institution. What we need is proper grassroots level cultural change. And that is really slow. That takes a long time to do it. But preprints are one of the ways into doing that. And there's one of the things, the reason I like preprints is they're really good at helping that cultural change happen. They're just, we all exist in a bubble and it's hard to get out of that bubble. Academics are very conservative.
Most of us, anyway. Nice to see you, Matisse. Matisse has a question which I'm going to roll out to Judy, and also ask Judy for any of her comments so far on our discussion today. Is there a way to incentivize for better reproducibility without enforcing regulations or quality control filters? Judy, what are the funding agencies
Yeah, I
saying
love this
on this?
question. I love the word incentives, because I think what we need to do is to put in the right incentives. And what we have done so far is probably not the right incentives, and given the pressure, and I don't think people like when we talk about research assessment, right? And what Jonny said about trust signals, we basically want to have real data and real interpretation, and but there is so much pressure, I think, in the system that incentivizes the wrong type of behaviors. But how can we incentivize the right thing? And I totally agree, cultural change. And and I think also it goes back to what I said earlier about, and I think many others said about transparency. And so imagine a world where we have, let's say, all machines, and we have so much technology, and I think we should really leverage technology. So imagine all your research data and all your machines actually being on some kind of a blockchain, so that you have the raw data. The raw data is continuously blockchained. I don't know what the right terminology is, but you know what I mean. So that it's stamped, that the data, you can't change it. Right. And even if yes, at the end of the day, maybe you still measure impact with publishing in Nature, but the whole process of publishing in Nature, I'm just using Nature as an example, it could be Science. But let's say using those top journals as an example, and if only they would then say, okay, we want to see the data. We want to see the whole, and also when you publish that, you go back and say, okay, this is the figure and this is the data, and the data was generated on day X on this machine at this location. This is how we found it, right? And so that kind of process where there's a lot more documentation, and it doesn't have to be work, it can, because we have so much technology to support that. We don't need to, do reporting manually anymore. Well, not as much. And so you can imagine a world where there is a lot more sharing, continuous sharing, and also even if somebody else comes and uses your data, right, you will still get that acknowledgement because that's one thing that I think a lot of scientists are afraid of when they think about preprints, when they think about posting their data online before it's published, that they have this anxiety that their data is going to get stolen. But let's face it, right? Like this is publicly funded information, right? Like the public, most of the research is done through public funding. And so one as a researcher gets that money, and we have you, and I'm not a researcher anymore, so I can't say we, but you have that responsibility to demonstrate what you have done with that money and the time you have spent on your research. The data is actually our data, the world's data, right? And so it's a responsibility and I think it should be a funding requirement that, when you do your research, you have it transparent and you have it continuously ongoing as a transparency and continuously feedback into your reporting. But really the reporting needs to be easy. Like the technology needs to facilitate that. And that's where I think one of the original questions was, what can publishers do? And I think publishers are well placed for this kind of data infrastructure. It sounds easy, I know. I'm just imagining the ideal world.
But getting publishers to do it is a different kind of kettle of fish, right? Sort of moving the analogy that I've heard is like trying to move like a super tanker, like from its current direction. Do you think that's true, Paul? I mean, like, what are your thoughts on all of this? And we also have a question about paper mills, human in the loop processes. So, Paul, your thoughts on this discussion so far?
Yes. So I largely agree with what Judy just said. And what I've always liked as a nice addition is to stop looking at individual academics, but start looking on like a research group level, right? Because I know from the Netherlands, and I think because the Dutch system is largely, at least the evaluation system, largely based on the ref in the UK, it's pretty similar there, that we're expecting researchers by now to be good at teaching, to be good at doing academic work, also to be good at writing this down in an academic publication, and ideally also to be good to communicate this to like a broader audience that is not academically trained. And this is basically impossible to ask from one single person to be good at all these aspects. But when we are evaluating people, we are looking at all those things into one person. So I guess it should be much better to look at the research group and say, like, okay, within this group, we want to see people that excel at the academic work. We are looking for people that excel at teaching their students, and all should have like sort of equal opportunity to get their promotion inside this academic world. Based on their expertise, right? We shouldn't expect them to be able to do everything. So that's like a nice addition, which is, I know in practice a bit maybe difficult to do, but it is something where I guess in the UK the ref and also the Dutch evaluation system is sort of aiming at by not just measuring what people do, but what individuals do, but measuring what a group does.
Can I jump in?
Of course. Just let me just say, nice to see you, Mary. Nice to see you, Esma. We're getting some good interactions going in the chat. Thanks for sharing that article. Sorry, Avi, and then to Jonny, because we want to make some further comments on preprints.
Yeah. So one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is what does every, we have one individual, okay, who, and what are they called in different contexts? Okay. So when you're a student, you will call the researcher your teacher or your professor, right? When you're in the lab, you'll be called a researcher. And when you're in publishing context, you'll be called an author. So it's really interesting, right? It's like we've got a lot of hats that are worn. And I think that one thing, if we go back to the question about publishers and what publishers can do, I think we need to stop calling them authors. And that comes obviously from general publishing. of like, but authors, I think the impression that's given off is that the writing, the text is the critical component of the process, and that's why we call them authors. And publishers do that because they know how to publish words, right? They know how to produce words. But actually, if we really want to get at the heart of the research endeavor, then it really is again the data or the output, which is I think what's most interesting. In fact, a lot of researchers I speak to say I don't read a paper from start to finish. If I'm designing my study, I'm going to jump to the methods. If I want to understand what the latest results are, I jump to the results in the discussion and I read that. So as you said, Garrett, it is a slow and large tanker which doesn't move quickly. But I do think that starting to think about the different pieces of the research project and how we evaluate those instead of just looking at the article as an article, maybe a starting point to get there. And I'm curious if there's been any experimentation with that with preprints, right? Like, is preprints a place where we can kind of use it as a sandbox or a playground to maybe take one step. I don't want to be too radical, but you're right. Take one step away from kind of the formatted, 4 to 5,000 word article, which we've had now for a few hundred years.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no was the answer. I do think we need to be careful when we talk about data and like who is research for, I think is a really important question we often don't ask when we're thinking about changing research. Because actually, it used to be for a very, very long time, it was about researchers. So all these things are really good, but it's becoming increasingly that, patient groups read papers and they need a different thing to what a researcher needs. So I think there's a nuanced discussion to go on there. But I think when it comes to preprints, yes, they can be more flexible. So you can post negative data in preprint form, for example. You can put relatively short articles out that are actually basically just data. It's a data set with a little bit of a description with it. We saw that during the pandemic heavily. Early on in the pandemic, huge preprint use, like 60% of the pandemic literature was preprinted, and most of those were very, very short articles. And when I say short, I mean literally it was a figure, a table. And that's great because it does allow that flexibility. A lot of the preprint servers have policies in place, which mean you've still got to have this sort of narrative. It looks like a paper. So there's work to do there. And coming back to the sort of question around trust and transparency, transparency I think is vital to trust. But one of the really big things we keep coming across with researchers, especially with preprinting, is there's this misconception that's existed since preprinting began around if I put everything out there, people are just going to steal it. And I've been doing a lot of work across Africa for the past couple of years, and this actually is a really interesting nuance to that one, which is people in Africa don't necessarily have the same resources as someone in the US, for example. And so they're very reluctant to be transparent with whether it's posting a preprint or sharing the data openly because they have a fear that someone else will come along and just replicate that within a month, and it might take them a lot longer than that. I said it was a misconception because it is. It's a myth. It just does not happen on any kind of scale. By all means, I can guarantee there will be some individuals out there stealing data from preprints and trying to do it quickly and publishing it. Happens with published research as well, actually. But there's just no data to see that as happening on a large scale. And this is one of the big problems with preprints. And as we get into transparent discussions, a lot of the issues kind of transfer over. There's a lot of conceptions people have, but often the reality is not that. And it's kind of sad. I think it's really sad if a researcher is saying, well, I don't want to put my work out because someone might steal it, but I'm not going to steal anyone's work. It's where's the trust in other people who are doing research?
Absolutely. That's probably the most common question that we get asked in our events and workshops about preprinting, and it's a big misconception.
Can I maybe add one thing, Gareth?
Yeah. Sorry, Paul. Of course.
Because just to have like a little bit of additional context, I also know that at some universities they actively discourage people that are working on interesting engineering concepts, not just to not publish on preprint servers, but also not to publish before they've spoken to their TTO, their Technology Transfer Office, right, for the patentability. And I also know that in some universities, well, not some universities, just some research groups, people not even share their ideas with their colleagues of the fear of it being stolen. So I think it's a much broader discussion than just like publishing or preprint. It's really also about the culture in these institutions, and that is something that institutions should incentivize much better to put things out there, because in the end, I think that's the role of academic research, right? To do research and share it with the world. And over the course of these hundreds of years, we sort of found an academic article to be the best way of sharing the outcomes. But maybe by now there are, well, other ways at least, and in some cases even better ways.
That's great. Everyone should feel free to jump in. Like, absolutely. This is a great discussion. Good to see you, Tony. Good to see you, Michael. Thank you for your questions. Judy, follow up on this as you talk to funding agencies and universities and research offices as well.
Yeah, I think everybody has a really good points. I like the word about team. I think was it Paul or Avi who mentioned, or Jonny, I can't remember, but somebody said teamwork, right? And I think there's something that we should talk more about. And how do we in, I think also teamwork, if you do it right, it also has the internal control element, right? So if we're talking about trust, right? So if you work together as a team, the odds of things happen that shouldn't happen, or funny things, or not so funny things. You build, yeah, you have internal checks, but also you're less likely to be. You're more likely to do the science right? You're more likely to question it in the right way, and drive, and not to mention the sheer challenges that we face as society. And I think that's what funders are trying to get at, right? Funders are trying to get at real world impact. We have real problems. And those problems are not going to be solved by individuals anymore. It's too much for us as individuals. So we need to incentivize teams, get people to work together, different disciplines to work together. And I think those collaboration ideas is amazing. But how do they find each other, right? And that's what I always wonder. Like, how do they make up those teams? Like, it seems so random. But I'm sure there's some science behind it, and I'm sure like maybe
Well, that's
Paul.
it. That's our function. Like tools like Prophy, tools like Global Campus, these networking tools that help researchers find each other. I think that's a really, really good point. Paul gets the credit for bringing up the discussion of teams. Jonny, will go to you, then we'll go to Avi, and then we'll go back to Paul. As we come into the final third of our event today, Jonny.
So I just want to pick up on what Judy said there about doing science right, because Avi also mentioned sort of getting back to the foundations of good science. I think this comes back to the larger issue of how we bring about these changes. I've already said I think top-down approaches are not the way forward. I think it is a grassroots cultural change we need. But we still train researchers as if we're in the medieval period, where you get an apprentice and you train them up however you want to do that. Some people do it brilliantly, some people do it horrifically badly. But that ultimately is still the system we use. And I think, if we're talking about all these kind of things we want to change and good science, doing good science right, that requires really good training of undergraduate and graduate students. And I think that's one of the things we bizarrely still have not seen in academia yet. There's been, I'm not that long out of being a grad student. I finished my PhD in 2019 in immunology, so very, very lab based. And there was no training during my graduate program about how to be a good scientist. It was all up to my PI. My PI was fantastic. So I think I'm a good scientist. But it was him. It wasn't this big program. Other people in the program, I worked with someone who was a terrible scientist. And it's we shouldn't have that kind of variability in a system that is so important to society, right? Society moves forward because of scientific advances. We should have a lot more standardization and standards, dare I say, in the training of science so that we do good science and we don't have these big trust issues.
All right, so we're drifting a bit away from assessment. So what I want to do now in the last 15 minutes of our discussion is bring it back to academic assessment. What have you learned then, Avi, from our discussions today, and how could this potentially be applied to some recommendations for universities and publishers to really look closer to zero in on academic assessment, would you say?
So I had never thought about, and again, I don't remember which colleague mentioned this, but I never thought about this idea of team assessment. and lab assessment, but it actually makes so much sense that I think it's a must, is to understand, and I guess it could be some sort of mixed methods where you evaluate the team and then maybe within the team there's some sort of evaluation of, contributions, because that's always a challenge when there's, a lot of people working on one project and one study. So I really like that idea, about, especially as funders push to see kind of impact and seeing where that leads, bring that back into the assessment ability. So it's not necessarily just did you get that grant or did you not get that grant, but what did you actually do with the project retrospectively. We're very much, it's science is a funny thing that by the time we actually publish whatever it is, we're already one or two studies ahead. So I always find that scientists don't find the time to celebrate their accomplishments. But more importantly, I think it maybe isn't taken into account assessment wise. It's like, well, you already got that NIH grant. So, well, that's great, right? So we now get the next grant. And it's like, well, what did you do with that grant, right? And how did it change? How did it impact people? And what were they, and again, not just how many articles did you manage to squeeze out, right? Or did you manage to rewrite in order to get, higher impact factor, but rather how, what were kind of the scientific conclusions? I mean, I know this is kind of cliche, but there are some Nobel Prize winners who say, I'd never would be able to be successful in today's day and age if I was assessed by, the current factors, simply because, they need to spend time to think. The ideas need to simmer, need to come about slowly. So the way I would, like to see moving forward is that we put more of an emphasis on quality rather than quantity, and that quality is evaluated in a much more kind of multifaceted way than the current impact factor or H factor or whatever it is, which really boils down into it does try to take different components into account, but in the end, as we like to say, you don't want to make the measurement the goal in and of itself. And I feel like that is come full circle when it comes to academic evaluation, is that as researchers, you come into your PhD with a lot of motivation and excitement, and you quickly learn the rules of the game. And if you're not into the rules of the game, and the rules of the game often, again, dictate where it is that you're going to go with your research, as opposed to curiosity and again, the basics of the scientific endeavor.
I totally agree. Like when I was working in the UK at a Russell Group university, my assessment was based on impact factor of publications and pounds in grant income that I banked for the university, and that was it. I want to go to Paul for some follow-up comments, and then what we're going to do in the last 10 or so minutes of our discussion today is just go around the room again and just get some quick final thoughts from all of our panelists. Paul?
Yeah, I'm sort of still chewing on this comment of Avi, right? That the measure becomes the goal, and I think that's that's already the case for a long time. I guess that we're measuring number of publications, impact factors, citations, and when you know what is being measured, you're gonna game, right? That's a very human thing to do, I guess. But I was also thinking of maybe some hopeful notes here, because there is some change, right? I know there are some discussions, and if things are moving slow, like mentioned before. But for instance, I'm not sure if this is the same everywhere, but in the Netherlands, the university gets money from the government if someone finishes their PhD, right? So there's a big incentive to let someone finish their PhD. And there are also some formal rules, like you have to have at least 4 publications or at least 5. And I know there's a lot of discussion, like, should we make this financing a bit different? And shouldn't we focus maybe on having exactly 4, but measuring a bit broader when someone is qualified to receive their doctor's title? And I think these are all very good discussions, because it sort of opens the door for a different way of assessing academic quality, which I guess is much broader than the number of publications and the number of citations. And the other thing that I guess is hopeful is I believe, again, it's the REF, the framework in the UK, and please correct me if I'm wrong, for those of you that are more familiar with the UK system, that you can only highlight your 5 publications in this assessment, which I think is a very good thing, right? Because if you're not just putting the number of citations in your evaluation or the number of publications, but only have to pick the top 5, then automatically it's more about the quality of what you do than about the quantity of what you do. And that's, I think, what we should want. Focus a bit more on the quality of the academic work and not so much on the quantity. And that in the end will also help the editorial office a lot, I guess, right? If there's more focus on quality of work instead of quantity. So let me wrap up with that comment.
Well, let's see. I mean, that's absolutely the ref in the UK. I believe there's a similar system in Australia. Like colleagues will correct me. Let's go around the room. Judy, Avi, Jonny, Paul, like give us like a few quick takeaways from our event today, like recommendations, the future of academic assessment. Like what should we be saying to publishers and universities? Let's imagine we were going to write a report, we may very well write a report, like just a quick kind of, white paper from our discussion today. What recommendations would we make? Judy?
I have some keywords written down. Cultural change is probably the biggest of those keywords if we have to make a word cloud. And I totally agree, because I think the inertia in the whole system is actually in the individuals. And if we can manage that cultural change so that people, researchers, are looking at each other, and to be fair, researchers are asking themselves, they're asking to be measured more broadly, but when they judge their colleagues, they still say, where did you publish your paper? I guess if I were a researcher, everybody needs to be thinking about how do you see research output and researchers' performance as a package. And that package includes how do you work with your mentees? How do you work with your colleagues? How do you demonstrate your research impact to the real world? All the things that are making the whole package as a researcher, as somebody who is generating knowledge. And I think this is a noble profession, by the way. So we should take it very seriously, and we should really incentivize the right behaviors.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Judy. Avi, some final recommendations? Let's imagine you're talking to like a leading, university assessment officer.
Yeah, so I think it's a matter of trying to balance, in a certain amount of independence, when it comes to enabling the researcher to pursue their own goals and dreams, but also a certain amount of evaluation and output. It's a funny, anyone who's been in any other industry and then comes to research, or the opposite, is in research and then goes to any other industry, understands there's a tremendous amount of independence that's given to researchers, still till today, with their time, with what they study, with kind of the students they take on. There's in sometimes, for example, in Germany, this is codified into law, where the universities can't even tell a researcher what they're not allowed to study. There aren't even topics that they, if, for example, a researcher would decide to, work with, on problematic, with problematic governments from around the world, they actually have a certain amount of leeway to be able to do that. And I think that it kind of, so what I would do is I would put together kind of the top research minds at the university, and I would, do a round robin, and I would ask them, how would you like to be held accountable? Now, but you need to be held accountable, right? So it's not just well, I don't want to be held accountable. But it's involving them in what they think are actually the real measurements of success. Because I think that one thing that hasn't been mentioned here, which I think is important, is also just the administrative bureaucracy that goes into this, right? I do a lot of work with research managers, and they're wonderful people. But that's become a whole layer in and of itself within a lot of these institutions, which also dictates a lot of where these things are going. So, and I've even seen some numbers where the amount that is invested in just trying to secure grants can sometimes outnumber the total that grants, that grants are coming in the first place. So I think we need to kind of a little bit hit the reset button, go back to the researcher being the prime, kind of center focus, not the administrators, and have an accountability program, but something that involves them in a very meaningful way.
Absolutely fantastic. Putting researchers back at the center. Jonny, your final thoughts from our panel today, please.
I think I'm very much with Judy. I think we need a cultural change. When we assess people, really we should be promoting people who have shown they can do the thing they're now going to do, because research is a very different job as you move up. And at the moment, we promote people on their ability to get a grant, and that's very luck-based. It's not a skill-based thing necessarily. And so I think we really need to start thinking about making sure we assess people based on the skills they need for the job they're applying for. Also, we can do things that are good to game. We can set targets that we want people to game. Transparency is a really good example. We want people to be transparent, so set that as a target, and they'll game it, and it's great. They'll just be more transparent. And then finally, the last point would be, we keep talking about things being systems, and I think we need to shift that to people. All the systems in science are run, created, and maintained by people. And so we need to change people, not systems.
And Paul, let me go to you for our final comments on our event today, if you'd be so kind.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with a lot of the things that were said, and I specifically like what Jonny just mentioned, right? That a lot of incentives are trying to capture what people do, but then automatically it becomes, of course, something you can game. But maybe we should think about incentives that we want to measure things that we want people to do, right? So not telling people what the quality what the quality is that we will measure for, but just let the people themselves decide like what they consider to be quality, and let them explain, right, when assessing the quality of their research. And for some people that will be in the numbers of their publications, and for some others it will maybe their influence on national policies. And it will make it hard to compare people, but it's already hard to compare people, right? It's very different if you're in engineering or in immunology or in humanities. So it doesn't already make any sense to compare these different types of academics with each other. So I can just agree with putting the researcher back in the center and try to focus on measures things that we want, like open your data sets to everyone.
Fantastic. Well, that brings us, everybody, to the end of our second in our series of Prophy Predicts events. Thank you so much for all of the engagement in the chat box. Thank you, Tony, Michael, Esma, Marie, and others, Mateus, who've put comments in the chat box. We'll circulate a recording of this event. We'll send the transcript of the chat as well to everybody, because there's been some absolutely fantastic comments. Do follow us, because we're going to do another of these events same time next month. It's going to be on funding specifically next time around, so do join us for that. And that just remains for me, Gareth, to say thank you, Paul, thank you, Judy, thank you, Jonny, and thank you, Avi, for joining us on our panel today. Have a great day, everybody, great evening, and see you again next time. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
For joining.
Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prophy. Bye.